Well, thank you all for coming out on this kind of gloomy afternoon. Although the weather's a nice change from what it's been recently, so we appreciate that. I'm Terry Panhorst. I'm the Vice President of the Board of Directors. And I'm going to say, as a quick introduction about Dr. Luna, a few things, some of his background, and then we'll let him get started here. He grew up in South Florida and then went to North Carolina at Duke University, where he earned his undergraduate degrees in biology and religious studies. From there, he attended UC Santa Barbara for his PhD in paleontology. Quite a jump there over to paleo, in which he earned in 2015, I believe. Is that correct? And his area of expertise involves fossil mammals in Chile. So we're certainly happy to have him come and speak today. In 2016, what was it? 2019, sorry, is when he joined the faculty at BSU and is teaching several different classes there on a spectrum of things: geology, evolution, paleontology, things of his interest. So I'm glad to see such a full group today, because I think when you leave, you will be looking at birds completely differently. I think he's going to convince you that, in fact, birds are dinosaurs. So,
or your money back.
Or your money back. There we go. Okay. So, Dr. Luna, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here today. I'm gonna, I guess, wait for my slides to come on. There we go. Perfect. Wanted to orient everyone first on kind of what we're going to be talking about time-wise. We're going to talk about especially Jurassic and Cretaceous a lot. So just to orient us on Earth's history, we can loosely clump the first 4 billion years or so of Earth history. We can call it Precambrian. We're not going to talk about any of this today. Earth is 4.5. This is Giga Annum, GA. 4.5 billion years old. A billion years is 1,000 million years. So that's quite old. I'll mention something about this very briefly at the end of the lecture. But then we get to this place where the fossil record becomes much more recognizable, full of things like that we are especially interested in, like animals, right? And we call that the Phanerozoic, which means visible life. And that's when the fossil record becomes full of animal fossils. And we divide the times, what we call the eras within the Phanerozoic, we divide into the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And so here I've zoomed in on the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Now almost all this lecture we're going to be talking about the Mesozoic, right? The Mesozoic is divided into these 3 bins that you've all heard of, I'm sure: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Right, so I'm going to use those words a lot. We're basically spanning between about 250 million years ago at the beginning of the Triassic to 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous. That whole chunk of time is called the Mesozoic. Almost everything that we're talking about today will be in this chunk of time, which is this chunk of time, right? The Mesozoic. Okay, this is usually where I start a lecture along these lines, or a course really in one of my classes at Boise State. I ask people this question in a class of about 100. I'll maybe have 3 get it right? If I had asked you this before you came to a lecture called Birds Are Dinosaurs, how many of you think you would have answered C? Right? That is the only correct answer here, right? Not a dinosaur, not a dinosaur, not a dinosaur, dinosaur. Every single bird is a dinosaur. Every single bird. Right? Not related to dinosaurs, not evolved from dinosaurs, though those things are true. They are dinosaurs.
So even the domestic chicken?
Even the domestic chicken, the turkey that you eat at Thanksgiving, yep, all dinosaurs. And you're going to be able to pick out some bones from those next time you eat them and kind of talk about some dinosaur characteristics. So first I want to start off with, I usually write this on a board, but there wasn't one handy. I'll just quickly say we're going to talk about first, what does this mean? Like, what does it mean that birds are dinosaurs? Then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of that idea and how it became an overwhelming consensus. And then we're going to go through sort of the evolution of dinosaurs and how they became more bird-like over time. And I'm going to really focus, we're going to take a closer look at feathers, which are a big part of that story. And then finally we'll wrap up on looking at early birds once they evolve, how they continue to evolve and change over time, bringing us to the more modern forms of birds that we're familiar with. Right, so that's what we're doing today, and we'll start off by talking about this first part. And actually, 90% of my slides, which there's a lot of, 90% of them are just like, let me just show you another cool fossil, let me show you another cool fossil, look at this change, look at this change, right? To me, the most important thing that anyone can take away from this talk is like, it is the next few 4, 5, 6 slides, right? Which is, what does it mean that birds are dinosaurs? Because that is what we really need to understand anything about evolution. The idea that unites all of life, that helps us understand how to name things, and things along those lines. All right, so let's jump right into that. A good place to start is with Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus established sort of a system, kind of preceded him a little bit, but he kind of really formalized it and really extended it in a very powerful way. He sort of established a system of taxonomy, and most people, if they ever remember anything about Linnaeus, they remember kingdom, phylum, order, class, right? And they had to memorize kingdom, phylum. I don't even know kingdom, phylum, order, class, families, right? I know those words. They mean very little, right? The thing that is most important about what Linnaeus did and the people who followed him did and realized about life is that life has this incredible nested sort of reality, the way we organize life. Like, I like to think of them as nested dolls, right? And so, for example, let's take an example. Ursus americanus, this is the black bear, right? Ursus americanus is within the genus Ursus. There's other sort of species within the genus Ursus. There's the brown bear, there's a polar bear, for example, right? And so Ursus americanus is Ursus americanus, but it is also Ursus, right? It is within this genus Ursus, right? That is within what you call the family, but again, that's a really kind of, whether it's called a family or an order is really kind of arbitrary, right? Then there's this group, Ursidae, which includes, on top of those bears that we just mentioned, it also includes pandas, red pandas, right? Those all have things in common, right? Things that make them bear-like, right? And so they kind of group together. And this is, I should say, this is in the 1700s. We're talking about 100 and 150 years before Darwin, right? And so then you've got another group that those bears fit into really nicely. All of these groups of the carnivorans, they have very similar styles of teeth that are really good at cutting meat. They have a bunch of other characteristics too, and they all share that in common, right? And then the carnivorans nest within a larger group that include mammals, right? Mammals have mammary glands, most of them have hair, things along those lines. And so all of those things have that. So Ursus americanus is Ursus. Ursus americanus is in the Ursidae. It is an Ursid, right? Ursus americanus, the black bear, is a carnivore. Right? Ursus americanus is a mammal. And so this is what Linnaeus did, and what was powerful, what he realized, is like people had done this a little bit with some groups, but what Linnaeus realized, and so the people who sort of built his work, is that like you can organize all of life this way in a really incredible sort of nested series of relationships, or a series of sort of nested, what we call nested hierarchies. Right? So for example, right? These are all animals. Right? Everything in here is an animal. They're multicellular. They have other animal characteristics that all of these things share, and then we call them animals in the big group animals. Now here's arthropods, mollusks, and vertebrates. Right? These are all animals, but a vertebrate is not a mollusk. A mollusk is not an arthropod. They're their own bins. Right? So you've got, let's look at arthropods. Within arthropods, you've got insects, crustaceans, arachnids. Now, an arachnid is not an insect, right? Don't make that mistake. A spider is not an insect, right? Insects have 6 legs. Arachnids have 8 legs, right? But within arachnids, there's ticks, there's spiders, there's scorpions, right? Within insects, there's beetles, bees, ants, flies, butterflies. Lots more stuff here. This is just illustrative, right? Obviously, there's more groups of animals in these 3 as well. right? And then within, I should say quickly that my, if it's, I don't have my thing.
I need to try something else.
If that'll work, no big deal, but I'll keep going. Okay, so let's move into a group that we're going to talk a lot more about, right? Which is vertebrates. So vertebrates includes a group called tetrapods, right? Tetrapods. And so tetrapods are a group of animals that live on land and have 4 limbs, right? Now, groups that live on land and have 4 limbs, in Linnaeus' mind, could easily be, there you go, that worked, could easily be divided into 4 groups, right? Mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and then, of course, birds in Linnaeus' mind, right? Because they're not reptiles, they're not mammals, they're not amphibians, right? There's a different group. Birds are very diverse, 3 times more species than there are of mammals, so this is a huge group, right? And those are all tetrapods. They all have 4 limbs. The wings of birds are their 3rd and 4th limbs, right? And then you've got within vertebrates, you've also got, our fish-like things, our sharks, and most of the fish that we think of here, right? But then these tetrapods, what I'm arguing is that birds are not in their own group, right? They belong here. And the beginning of this realization, obviously, like everything in biology, begins with Darwin, right? I'm telling you that dinos is a different type of reptile, and birds are within the dinosaurs. And so birds are dinosaurs, birds are reptilians, birds are tetrapods, birds are vertebrates, birds are animals, right? Nested hierarchies. Right? Just like a tick is an arachnid, a tick is an arthropod, a tick is an animal, but a tick is not an insect, a tick is not a gastropod. Right? These nested hierarchies. Now, in this time, when people were doing this for 100 years, since through the 1700s and into the 1800s, they were organizing and realizing that life fits in these nested bins, and they had no idea why. Right? All they could say was like, wow, we must be looking at like God's organizational pattern. He must be like a super organizer, like that woman who does the Joy show of like organizing things, right? Like we're looking into his mind, because he must love organization, because he definitely could have made amphibians with 8 legs, right? But he didn't, right? And so he likes to be really organized. So fast forward 120, 130, 140 years, and Darwin's thinking a lot about this. He's traveling and seeing a bunch of crazy stuff, fossils and things in the Galapagos, fossils in South America and things in the Galapagos. And he starts to think, okay, this organization that we're talking about. For example, I just chose a few things here out of thousands, right? Birds are a type of tetrapod, as we just said, right? Things with 4 limbs. So are titans, right? Within those, all of these things have a backbone, right? We can call them vertebrates. They have a backbone, and they have that sort of body plan. Now, within here, all of these things are animals, right? This does not have a vertebral backbone, so it's not in that group, right? But they're all animals. This is the Linnaean hierarchy that we all know and have known for 100 plus years. And what Darwin says is, and a lot of people, they think Darwin and they think natural selection, right? Natural selection is a great idea, an important idea, certainly not the only great idea in evolution. By far, the most important insight that Darwin ever had, and one of the most important scientific, philosophical insights that humans have ever had, right, is that this nested hierarchy exists because it conveys relationships. That's what Darwin did. That's Darwin's biggest contribution, not natural selection, right? That's like how things might change over time. His biggest contribution was this idea of the tree of life. This is really sloppy. Let's simplify it, right? The tree of life, which is that all of these things have similar characteristics that evolved here, right? They're all multicellular, and so that all of this group of animals would then diversify into all sorts of different branches. And let's zoom in on these branches. All of these things have, they have a vertebral column, the backbone. They have a postanal tail. They have gills, right? At least at some point in their development, right? All of those things share those things. That's because in this lineage that evolved after animals would split into multiple, not just these, but multiple lineages, right? And in this lineage, those characteristics would evolve, and that's why all of these things have those characteristics. And then some of those groups would evolve 4 limbs from their fins, right? And then some of those groups within here, some of them would evolve wings and feathers, and we call those birds. that these nested hierarchies are the result of an evolutionary tree, the tree of life. This is Darwin's greatest contribution. He called this common descent with modification, right? And that explains all of life. The best evidence that we have of evolution is that it fits all of our understanding of life's organization, right? When we look at it, and we're going to see that very clearly in the bird story in a second here, right? And I kind of can't emphasize this enough, right? It's on 1830, so Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, right? It's like, in its original sort of format, I forget, it's like 900 pages. This is the only figure in 900 pages to emphasize how important an idea this is, right? And this is in 1859. In 1837, right, when he got back from his Beagle voyage, is when he started thinking about this idea. Because this idea had important ramifications and it has testable consequences, right? If it's true, so actually, I'll just explain this. This is 1837. This is his first sketches in the famous Bean notebook. After he gets back from his voyage of the Beagle, he draws this branching tree, right? And he writes these notes on it, kind of saying, and I'll explain what these notes are saying in effect, right? Not exactly the example, but a good one that's illustrative, in effect, what he's saying, right? What he's saying is like, okay, we've got these groups, right, that can be somewhat different, and if they're related, there must be connections between them that go deeper, right? In other words, we've known since Linnaeus that whales are mammals, right? They're not fish, they've got all sorts of mammal characteristics, they're warm-blooded, they produce milk, etc., 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 right? We've known since Linnaeus that whales are mammals. If that is true, and this was Darwin's greatest gift as a scientist, right? 800 pages of The Origin of Species. The arguments could be laid out in a few pages if he wanted to. It was looking at all available evidence, and then what he did really well was say, if these things are true, these other things are things that we should be seeing. And that's the heart of what science is, right? We call that falsifiability, right? If you have a hypothesis, and it's a scientific hypothesis, there has to be ways to test it. And Darwin lays out in hundreds of pages, here's an idea, here are ways that if this is true, these are things that we should be seeing. And so what Darwin says in this, and in this, and in The Origin of Species is, okay, we know whales are mammals. This is clear in the nested hierarchy. We've known this since Linnaeus for 100 plus years. If that's the case, and evolution is true, and evolution is the reason we see these nested hierarchies, if that is all true, then what we should see is how a group of mammals that lives in the water evolved from terrestrial ancestors, right? And we should see step by step by step by step. If we find more and more and more fossils, we should find transitional forms that show us how whales became better adapted to the ocean. And that was a huge prediction at the time. There were no transitional forms, or not recognized transitional forms, and not really good ones, even if they were later recognized. Right? There weren't any sort of really clear transitional forms of fossils in Darwin's day, right? 1859. And this is what he says we should find. Keep looking for fossils. If we don't find this, my ideas aren't true. Right? Darwin says that explicitly. Of course, we have found many of those fossils. We could do another lecture on whale evolution next time, right? Dozen or so early transitions. Once you get to the crown group of whales and dolphins today, transitions between the two modern groups that are toothed and have baleen. So dozens of transitional fossils. This is, if we have a top 5 transitional fossil records, right? Whales is in them, but birds is my favorite. That's why we're talking about them today. And everyone wants to hear about dinosaurs. That's why we're talking about them today. No one wants to hear about South American mammal evolution, which is what I really know all about, a lot more deeply. But that's fine. This is good stuff. So this is what we're going to do, not for whales today, right? Maybe a future lecture. We're going to do this for for dinosaurs. Right? We're going to do this for dinosaurs and see how dinosaurs changed over time and how birds evolved within that group. We're going to kind of zoom in here on tetrapods. This is that group that lives on land. Remember, it has 4 limbs. The group that lives on land and have four limbs include the amphibians. Right? These are still kind of tied to water because they evolved from fish. Right? Well, another lecture. Then amniotes, right? These are the groups that lay eggs on land. They include the mammals and the reptiles, and we're saying that birds are dinosaurs, dinosaurs are reptiles, reptiles are amniotes. That's how these trees work. This is important. This is a place that we should stop, and you should look at this and kind of see how this is where I want to see if there are any questions. So, a bird is a dinosaur. A dinosaur is a reptile. Reptiles are amniotes. Reptiles are tetrapods. Synapsids are amniotes. That's what we want to do when we name things, right? We want a name to refer to a common ancestor and everything that descended from it. So everything here that descended from this point in the tree, everything here is downstream, so to speak. All of those things are amniotes, right? It's the only good way to name things in an evolutionary context, otherwise it gets confusing. So everything that descended from here is a dinosaur, hence birds are dinosaurs, just like you are a mammal, right? A bird is a dinosaur. Right? That's what it means that birds are dinosaurs. Right? And now, what we'll get to is all the evidence for this in just a second, right? But that's what it means. Birds are dinosaurs is no different than saying you are a mammal. That is not a controversial statement at all, right? In paleontology, neither is it controversial at all that birds are dinosaurs, right? 30 years ago it was controversial, not anymore. All right, questions here, especially about just like looking at a tree, how you read it. I'll add, right? Remember what I started with? Pterosaurs. Are pterosaurs dinosaurs? No, they're closely related to dinosaurs. They're very closely related to dinosaurs. They lived around the same time. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. They're closely related to them. Right? Are crocodiles dinosaurs? No. If you hear that crocs are crocs related to dinosaurs? Crocs are the closest living relative to dinosaurs, right? Meaning also birds, right? Because birds are dinosaurs. Right? This thing, sailback thing that many of you learned in your dinosaur books growing up, right? Does anyone remember what this is called?
Dimetrodon.
Dimetrodon, right? In a group called Pelycosaurs. Dimetrodon, not a dinosaur, more closely related. Here's mammals, right? This is not a mammal, this is not a mammal, but this is showing how mammals evolved from reptile-like things over time. This is another top 5 transitional fossil record right here. That is how mammals evolved from reptile-like ancestors. Very cool story. One of my favorite, actually. And so, Dimetrodon is an early synapsid. It is more closely related to you, which you're here. It is more closely related to you at this point than it is to a dinosaur. Okay?
Wow. Does this is a cladogram, right?
This is called a cladogram or a phylogeny.
But does it show that mammals evolved before dinosaurs?
No, there's no time on here other than branching sequence.
Okay.
Right? I could adjust all of this to time, and you'll see some that show that. This just shows relationship. Mm-hmm. So what this shows is that mammals and this are more closely related to each other because of this ancestor, more recent common ancestor, means more closely related. Just like you're more closely related to your sister than your cousin, because with your sister you share your parents, with your cousin you share your grandparents, right? So this is showing more close relationship. There's no time on this other than, obviously, you can't have this happen or this happen until after this happens, right? You get this split happens, and then these splits happen, and then these splits happen, but there's no chronology built in. It doesn't show you when that happens on this tree. So this is just showing relationship. Any other questions here? Okay, we'll move on to our next part. From our early hints to overwhelming consensus. From early hints to overwhelming consensus. First specimens of one of the most important fossils ever discovered 1 year and 2 years after Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. Remember, he publishes The Origin of Species in 1859, right? In 1860 and 1861, the first 2 specimens of Archaeopteryx are discovered. This has turned out to be the iconic transitional fossil, one of the most important fossils ever discovered. The first specimens were described by Richard Owen, the greatest paleontologist in the world at the time. Darwin was not a biologist at first. He was more of a geologist, so a lot of his work depended on sort of consulting other people and other people's work to become a better sort of biologist over 20 years. When he came back from the Origin of Species in 1837, when he came back from the Voyage of the Beagle in 1837, it took him 20 years, right, to write the Origin of Species, even though the ideas had already kind of been there, because he was consulting with experts, looking at all the evidence, thinking through the ideas. In any case, this is one of the world's experts of the time in paleontology. He describes this new bird, right, Archaeopteryx. In 1866, in the fourth edition of the Origin of Species, Darwin says, now we know, on the authority of Professor Owen, that a bird certainly lived during the deposition of the Upper Greensand. We now know this as Jurassic, right? This is a place called the Solnhofen Limestone, right? The Upper Greensand, that a strange bird, the Archaeopteryx, with a long lizard-like tail and with its wings furnished with two, we now know three, one was covered, 3 free claws, that'll become important, has been discovered in Solnhofen, right? Hardly any recent discovery shows more forcibly than this how little we as yet know of the former inhabitants of the world, right? He's making a point here. He's not saying, oh, this is a perfect link between birds and dinosaurs, because that's not his expertise, right? He's not an anatomist, right? But what he's saying is this is an important point, right? Darwin is saying, when the Origin of Species came out, one of the main arguments was, hey, we have thousands of fossils, Darwin. We don't have any transitional fossils. Isn't that a pretty good idea? Indication that your ideas are bogus, right? And Darwin was making a point. He's like, yeah, we have thousands of fossils, but I don't think that's very many, really, when you think of how deep time potentially is, and that was kind of becoming clear in the decades before Darwin, like how old Earth might be, not age, but an unfathomably old sort of series of rocks stacked up on top of each other. What this showed was something very important to Darwin's argument, which is this. Up to that point, the oldest bird was about 20 million years old. That's like, barely see it here, right? 20 million years. Very recent. Only geologists and paleontologists can say that, right? 20 million years. That was the oldest bird. And he didn't know 20 million years, but they knew Miocene, right? When Darwin was writing in 1815, but then discovery of Archaeopteryx, suddenly the bird fossil record goes back 10 times further to 150 million years old. We now know, but he knew it was Jurassic, which was far older, right? When dinosaurs were roaming the earth, right? And that's the main point he's making, is look at this huge gap. Birds have been around for a lot longer than we could have ever realized. How much have they changed? We didn't have any fossils of any of those before. There must be a bunch out there. We got to keep looking for these fossils. Well, then comes around Thomas Henry Huxley, one of the greatest scientists of all time, who very few people know about. Darwin's bulldog, one of the people to really take on a lot of Darwin's early battles, right? He looks at Archaeopteryx. He is an anatomist. He is a paleontologist. He's in this new wave that grew up with some of Darwin's ideas, or at least he was an adult, but kind of read the Origin of Species and was like, mind blown. This totally makes sense of so many things I've been trying to work out, right? And he's an anatomist, and he describes Archaeopteryx as a link between birds and dinosaurs. Right? In 1868, right, within a decade of Darwin. Right? Then, a few years later, the most famous of all these specimens was found. This is not the real one, because the real one is one of the most priceless and important fossils ever discovered. It's in Berlin, right? But this is a replica of it here. The Berlin specimen was discovered in 1875. It was sold by a farmer for the money to buy a cow, right? And of course, if here in Boise, you'll see plenty of this around, right? Arcteryx, Archaeopteryx. Right? It's shortened for Archaeopteryx. It is not only an Archaeopteryx, it is the Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx. Right? So next time you see someone wearing that, tell them a little bit about birds being dinosaurs. Right? And this important transitional fossil. And that's why Arcteryx, our whole motto, right, is evolution, always evolving, right, as a brand or whatever. So that's where that comes from. All right. Okay, so haven't we known then this since the late 1800s? Well, in the early 1900s, paleontologists begin to argue that a lot of these dinosaur-like things that Huxley pointed out, that we'll get to in a little bit, right? A lot of these dinosaur things could just be, maybe, just like butterflies evolved flight and bats evolved flight, but no one thinks they're closely related, right? Maybe they're just similar. We call that convergence, when two things evolve that are similar along different branches. They say maybe that's just convergence, right? The things that make this look like a dinosaur, no one was arguing that it wasn't a bird because it's got feathers all over, right? Big, long feathers on its arms. So it's clear an early bird, right? But maybe the things that made Huxley think they were dinosaurs, they're not really, they're just sort of happenstances of similar evolution, right? Not showing that relationship, right? And one of the main things I'll say was we had started to find more and more and more dinosaurs, and we hadn't found any dinosaur clavicles, right? And one of the most characteristic things about birds is not only do they have clavicles like us, their clavicles are fused. What do we call that?
Wishbone.
Wishbone, right? So how could dinosaurs have evolved from this group that didn't even have clavicles? How could birds have evolved from dinosaurs? Because birds have these fused clavicles, dinosaurs don't even seem to have them.
Yeah.
So maybe this isn't the explanation in the early 1900s. Well, fast forward to the 1970s. More and more fossils are being found. More and more dinosaurs are being found. Dinosaurs with clavicles are being found, right? And finally, because they're very, who's a mountain biker? Any mountain bikers here? Any broken clavicles in the room, right? Doesn't take a lot of force to break that clavicle because it's not a very strong bone. So these weren't found for a long time until we started finding them, right? But then on top of that, we started finding dinosaurs like Deinonychosaurus, right? Like the Velociraptor relative, right? Like Deinonychus, I mean. That made us rethink how we thought dinosaurs lived and behaved and their metabolism and all sorts of things, right? Dinosaurs for the longest time were thought to be these huge, slow-moving beasts. And then we found more, and whereas birds are fast and they have a high metabolism and they're warm-blooded and all these things, but when we start finding more and more dinosaurs that are kind of revealing all sorts of different expectations that we thought dinosaurs were, Ostrom does these in the 1970s, Yale paleontologist, does these incredibly detailed reanalysis of Archaeopteryx, analysis of these new dinosaurs coming out, and he's saying, hey, I don't have like a few characters here. I'm looking at hundreds of characters that suggest birds are dinosaurs. So that's 1970s, but that's in great, huge, thick monographs to always tell my students. That does not mean one paper is now a scientific established thing that you're going to learn in school. You didn't learn any of this in school, right? And so it takes time. Right? 1970s, 80s, his grad students start doing stuff. 80s, now 80s into the 90s. Now it's in the paleontologists are at least talking about it. They're debating on it. Maybe they're split somewhat 50-50 by the time we get to the 90s. But it's an idea that's strong enough that when Jurassic Park comes out in 1994, the only good Jurassic Park, right, that came out, right? Dr. Grant is talking about how Velociraptor has all these bird characteristics, right? So that was an idea that was out there, but it wasn't firmly established. It was debated.
We even talked about warm-bloodedness.
We even talked about warm-bloodedness, right, in that movie, which there was plenty of evidence of for many groups of dinosaurs. Then, in 1996, one of the most important discoveries in the history of paleontology, my favorite dinosaur, when anyone asks, right, Sinosauropteryx, right, from the early Cretaceous of Liaoning. We're going to talk about that more in a second. This is the smoking gun. Because Ostrom has been saying, if birds are dinosaurs, we expect to find more and more bird-like characteristics in dinosaurs that weren't flyers, that weren't birds. And then Liaoning, this dinosaur, Sinosauropteryx, comes from it. And it appears to be covered in feathers. And it not appears to be, we'll see in a few minutes that it's totally covered in feathers. Right? This went from active debate to almost overnight consensus, but that was 1996. Since then, we have found so many more fossils that have made this an even more overwhelming consensus. And I'm going to show you some of that evidence. Next, I want to talk really quickly about this place, Liaoning. These are incredible fossil sites, both Liaoning and another place in China. This is Liaoning and in Gansu province as well. These are places with these lake deposits that didn't have a lot of oxygen. That's good for preservation. They also were fed by a lot of ash. That's great for preservation.
Very good.
Ash is very fine grained. When it covers something, it covers it in exquisite detail. Think of like pixels in a camera, right? Pixels in a camera, you can get a sharper image. Tiny, tiny fine-grained ash particles covering something helps preserve them exquisitely. Some of the best fossils that have ever been found in the world come from these areas, especially Liaoning. We're talking about salamander skin and gills preserved. We're talking about the food that this mammal ate, the little dinosaur that this mammal ate, in its stomach. Hair on a mammal. The skin of this Psittacosaur dinosaur that allows you to see the melanin in the skin. Right? Incredible, incredible detail from this place. Liaoning, all the fossils come from about here. Right? They're Cretaceous in age. Early Cretaceous in age, yeah.
Was there some new technology after the 90s that they were able to find these faster, more readily?
In the 90s, it's literally same thing as far as getting them out. Since the 90s and into the 2000s, lots of new technologies for exploring, for being able to see the integumentary structure more, for being able to see the color of the feathers based on the structures that were, the color of the feathers based on the structures that were within them, things along those lines. So a lot of new analytical tools, but the work of getting fossils out of the ground has basically not changed for millennia, right? Okay, so this I'm going to run through quick, right? Just flood you with evidence, and as I do that and overwhelm you with a bunch of evidence, right, I want you to remember I am showing you the smallest portion of what's out there, which is what made this hard to put together. All right, here we go, right? So we're gonna go through this, and we're gonna see, look at these characters that you think of as bird-like, but they evolved throughout the evolutionary tree that way before we get to birds. That's the point of what we're about to run through. Beta keratin scales. All reptiles have beta keratin scales. Do you have keratin? Where?
Near
Nails. You have keratin. Where else do you have keratin?
hair.
Hair is keratin, but our keratin is alpha keratin, right? It means it's arranged in an alpha helix. Beta keratin means it's a pleated sheet, a folded sheet. They're arranged differently. So we both have keratin, but all reptiles have beta keratin scales. Beta keratin scales, beta keratin scales. These are beta keratin scales. Right? What are we looking at there?
Chicken foot.
Chicken foot, right? Beta keratin scales. What else are we seeing that's made out of beta keratin here?
Little claws.
Feathers are made out of beta keratin. Feathers are essentially modified scales. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, right? Digitigrade stance, upright posture. So this is not bipedal. This is bipedalism here. This is an early dinosaur, Herrerasaurus. But I'm not focusing on bipedalism. I'm talking about digitigrade stance and upright posture. Let's talk about each of those in turn. Digitigrade stance, right? When you walk, your heel bones hit the ground, right? When T-Rex walked, its heel bones never hit the ground. They were always held up like this, like when you walk tiptoe, right? That's how T-Rex walked. Its ankle joint was here. So do birds, right? Digitigrade stance. These are the fingers. This is the ankle. Never hits the ground, right? Think of that when you see birds. This is not a knee, right? That is an ankle,
So that's
right? That is not a knee. That is an ankle, right? The knee is here. Right? This is something that almost certainly evolved for running to extend the stride, and that's something that we see in the ancestors of pterosaurs and dinosaurs. Right? Digitigrade stance. What about upright posture? Right? Well, you can also call erect posture. Lizards have their postures out like this. When a lizard runs, it goes like this. Right? Crocs are getting further erect. Dinosaurs have a much more erect posture. Their limbs are directly underneath their body, right? Whether it's four-legged or two-legged. Limbs directly beneath the body. What does that enable, right? Less energy needed to support the body. Do you think if I stood like this or like this, how long could I support myself, right?
You'd be pretty tired by the time you get,
Right? This is a lot harder than this, just because here, I mean, I'm not even thinking about, like, I used to do wall sits, right, in volleyball and basketball. Your legs out from your body, and you can only do this for like a minute before your muscles just start firing. But when your legs are directly beneath your body, you can stand and not even think about it for hours, right? Maybe your feet get tired, but you don't feel your legs getting tired. Greater speed, easier to support the body, and this enabled the attainment of these huge sizes, right? If it weren't for having these column-like limbs directly underneath the body, these groups could not have gotten as big as they are. We see that kind of transitioning through reptile evolution until we get to dinosaurs. And of course, birds have that configuration also. But wait, don't we have that configuration? Right? Cows have that. Look at those little spindly legs. How could those little spindly legs hold up all that weight if they were splayed out like this? And we have that same configuration with the upright stance, right? That's an example of convergence, exactly, right? There are things that evolve independently in different lineages. And when we talk about independent evolution, we've got to mention pterosaurs evolve flight. Birds evolve flight. They both fly, but that does not make a pterosaur a bird. It does not make a bird a pterosaur. That flight evolved in different ways along different lineages. Mammals also evolved flight. Which ones? Bats. When we look at pterosaurs, which evolved flight first, then birds, which evolved flight second, then bats, which evolved flight third, they all evolved flight from their forelimbs, but in very different ways. Pterosaurs had one long finger bone,
Right.
which is pretty cool, right? Birds, as we'll talk about, take their finger bones and fuse them together, the 3 finger bones that they have. Bats take their finger bones and elongate them, 3 or 4 fingers, depending on the bat group, and that we're elongating, right? So these all evolve flight, but in different ways. In different ways. Evolve wings in different ways. So this is convergence. Flight evolved here, flight evolved here, flight evolved within here. Right? But they happened independently. Does not mean they're all closely related to each other. Right? They're all related as amniotes, but they're not all particularly close related because they have flight. Okay, let's zoom into dinosaurs now. Dinosaurs have this upright posture, 230 million years old, right? It was when we see the first dinosaurs, as I mentioned. This is in the Triassic. Right? The first dinosaurs about 230 million years, and we see these things that have this upright posture. We're not going to talk about 2 dinosaur groups because we don't have time. But they include the ornithischians, which are most of the herbivores that you can think of. They include the sauropods, which include the big long necks, the rest of the herbivores you can think of, the big long necks. And they include the theropods, which are this incredibly diverse group that includes all the meat eaters that you can think of. Name a meat-eating dinosaur. T-Rex, Velociraptor, those are the 2 I heard. Any others? Allosaurus, right? You'll see all of those. Those are all within the theropods, right? They have fused clavicles and thin-walled hollow bones, right? Thin-walled hollow bones. Let's talk about that, right? Thin-walled hollow bones is an adaptation, we think, early on for these things from predators. This is a way that we think they lightened their skeleton to make them faster. Their bones were more hollow, less heavy than the bones of other dinosaurs. So I often get emailed pictures of just bone shafts like this, and like people say, "What is this?" I'm like, "I don't know, a bone shaft, right?" You can't tell a bone shaft from any other bone shaft unless it's a theropod, because when you look at the shaft and you see it's thin-walled, hollow bones, and you say this is at least a theropod bone shaft, right? That's something that birds have taken to a more extreme, because obviously being lighter is an important adaptation for flying, right? Fused clavicles, and I'll say this is something that is, like everything, is a little more complex than this. This is something that evolved and maybe was lost, and kind of exactly the degree of fusion is changes or whatever. But fused clavicles are the wishbone that we talked about, right? Lots of theropods had wishbones. We didn't find them early on for a while, but once we started finding more complete skeletons, we found more and more, not just wishbones, fused wishbones, something only living birds have out of all the animal kingdom. Right? It's called the furcula or the wishbone. Not very happy about it. Gary Larson, nice.
Oh, there.
Yeah, right there.
Okay, let's zoom in on this group then, since this is where birds are. This group that has fused clavicles, thin-walled bones, these meat-eating dinosaurs and theropods. Just some early pictures of some of the early diverging ones, some of the earliest ones, things like Eoraptor, Coelophysis, Dilophosaurus from Jurassic Park, the one that Steven Spielberg for some reason made smaller, and then for obvious reasons made poisonous, even though there's no evidence for that. Carnotaurus here, a ceratosaur dinosaur from Argentina. Just moving on here, those are some early groups, but then a group would evolve called tetanurans that have some very bird-like characteristics. They have 3-digit hands, and they have complex air sacs. They include a bunch of things. These are some of the early divergent groups here. I'll talk about some of those more in just a second. But first, to emphasize, they have 3-digit hands. 1, 2, 3. Birds, those 3 digits become fused, as we mentioned, in one structure, right? But they do have 1, 2, 3 vestigial digits, right? So birds have 3 digits. These things all had 3 digits. And look at that formation. We're going to see that in the earliest birds, these perfect 3-digit hands. We'll see them here, right? This is one of the most, for lack of time, I'm going to skip this, right, because this is a kind of complex one, but it basically has to do, is that in this group we have evidence that that dinosaurs could do something that birds could do that we can't do, that we wish we could do, which is get oxygen all the time, right? You are getting oxygen half of your life, because half of your life you're breathing in, and half of your life you're breathing out, right? And that's a waste of half of the amount of energy that you could be making, right? Because when you're breathing out, you're not breathing in oxygen. Birds have a sweet trick for not doing this, for breathing in, storing air, and then when they breathe out, that air gets pumped into their lungs, so they're always getting oxygen. So did dinosaurs, so did tetanurine dinosaurs, right? And it's a more complex story that I want to get into there, but that group, tetanurines, some quick things. The early tetanurines include Spinosaurus. Anyone heard of Spinosaurus?
Oh, yeah.
What's cool about Spinosaurus that just was recently discovered? Yeah, anyone know? Yeah, like in your life? They were like crocodiles. Yeah, they were semi-aquatic. Yeah, they evolved back into the water a little bit. Right? Allosaurus, before T-Rex evolved, Allosaurus was a dominant meat eater in North America before millions of years before T-Rex evolved. Giganotosaurus, which was originally called Gigantosaurus, but then some little tiny lizard was given the name Gigantosaurus, ironically, so they had to change their name to Giganotosaurus, is actually bigger than T-Rex. So T-Rex is not the biggest of the meat-eating dinosaurs, but it does have the strongest bite force still, its most robust skull. And then I have to tell you about Megalosaurus, right? This is the first dinosaur fossil ever named. What was it named?
Scrotum.
It was thought to represent evidence of the titans of Greek lore or the giants that biblical references include. It was called Scrotum humanum, right? In this publication here, like the early 1700s, right? It turns out that is actually the distal end of a femur of a Megalosaurus, and in a bit of irony here, a really interesting coincidence, right? Megalosaurus was the first described dinosaur, the first described actual dinosaur, right? Parts of this were discovered, parts of some other bones were discovered, and it was described as this large, crazy lizard reptile thing that Owen, if you remember him, said, we're going to call it, this thing is a new group of ancient reptiles that we're going to call dinosaurs. So not only was it the first dinosaur fossil that ever made it in publication incorrectly, right? It later also became the first described dinosaur, okay? Which is kind of crazy to think about. All right, in any case, so those are theropods. Then tetanurines evolved, right? And there were other theropods that aren't tetanurines, right? None of these are tetanurines. None of these tetanurines that we just talked about are coelurosaurs, right? Coelurosaurs have a bowed ulna and simple feathers. Here's the bowed ulna, bowed like a bow and arrow, right? Yeah. And here, and then we'll talk about simple feathers. Bowed ulna. Anyone know where you see a bowed ulna?
Which one when you're eating chicken wings?
Humerus.
Yep.
Ulna.
Right.
That space. A lot of most things that have these same bones that we do, there's not a lot of space in between those bones. There's this big amount of space between those two bones. That's something that's characteristic of coelurosaurs. Birds are coelurosaurs, right? Again, going back here. Birds are coelurosaurs. They're tetanurines. They're theropods. They're dinosaurs, right? So, radius, that's the radius. Right? I'm sorry, humerus, right? Humerus, radius and ulna. Radius and ulna, the bowed ulna, is what gives us a lot of space. We think that this is probably to accommodate larger muscles for more hand movement. And we'll see in a little bit that fits with something else we see. Tyrannosaurs and compsognathus both had both of these things, bowed ulna and simple feathers. Let's talk about that. Simple feathers. This was that 1996 discovery, and I should say very quickly, when this was discovered, right, there was a big meeting called the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting every year. It's, rooms 10 times bigger than this. For each group, subgroup, it's like, the South American mammal group is going to have, 100 people from around the world all listening to the talks on South American mammals. Another group studying crocodiles from Africa. Another group studying blah, blah, blah. Dozens and dozens of huge rooms, right? You're talking about over 10,000 scientists, right? Or maybe not the biggest ones, over 10,000 scientists. All vertebrate paleontologists, right? When this was discovered, they just brought a photo of it before writing it up to the meeting. And in like 1997, and it kind of shut down the meeting, right? And because everyone just wanted to see a picture of this dinosaur that had all these feathers that are so detailed that they have the protein structures preserved in them that give them color, and the size and shape of those protein structures helps us see what color that dinosaur was, right? That is as accurate a rendition of a dinosaur as you'll ever see, color included, right? Based on all available evidence on those tiny structures within those feathers. Exactly Austin's prediction that we should find more bird-like characteristics, and this is it. This is like a T-Rex, a little mini T-Rex. This thing was not flying.
They were all downy too. They weren't shafted.
That's what we'll talk about in just a sec. They're downy-like feathers, simple feathers, right? This not only shuts down the meeting, everyone just wants to go see this photo, right? There's no research that's been done yet. It takes years to describe and something. Just see the photo. People are going up to John Ostrom. 20 years. He's been arguing that birds are dinosaurs, right? It's debated for the last decade, right? And people are going up to hugging him. This is the clincher that everyone knew was coming, or the people that were in the camp of birds are dinosaurs, right? That everyone knew was coming. It's a very emotional day for him, right? I'm emotional just thinking about it.
What is happening to the lizard in that last photo?
He's eating something.
What is going on with that stuff in the air? Is that water?
He's got water flinging off his tail. Artistic.
He just grabs it out of the water.
Artistic license.
There
Okay.
are some
First, they look like feathers, sure. Are they really feathers? How can we know that for sure? Well, first, then we've started finding the proteins that only occur in feathers called melanosomes, right, that give them very specific colors, right? Then we started finding in amber tails of coelurosaurs with those feathers perfectly preserved in amber, right? This is 100 million year old amber from Myanmar, right? Beautiful feathers. Nope, that's not as good an image as I thought. Of course, modern birds still have simple feathers. What do I mean by simple feathers? Down-like feathers. Down-like feathers. We'll get back to that. So coelurosaurs, not just compsognathids have simple feathers. Tyrannosaurs had simple feathers.
Those little ducks have, and the lizards, were they able to oil them so they could float, or were they not oiled?
It's a good question. I don't think they were. They probably were not.
Because they could bear, have
Well, actually, I would guess. Yeah, I mean, hair is slightly oiled too,
Yeah.
so I would imagine the feathers would be slightly oiled. But it's a good question.
Did you see those little ducklings? They just follow the mom,
Right. Yeah. So we don't have a lot of T-Rex is known from North America. We don't have fossil sites like Liaoning, China, in North America with that exquisite level of detail. But where we do have tyrannosaur relatives, so there's Tyrannosaurus rex, the most recent and biggest of all the tyrannosaurs. But this is all very tyrannosaur-like groups, right? That show us how this group was evolving over time, including Eutyrannus and Dilong, both from Liaoning, both with evidence of feathers. Right? So this group had feathers. This is Eutyrannus from Liaoning. You can see some of the feathers. A little zoom in here. Right? Does this mean that T-Rex itself, which was a North American, we don't have the preservation to see what the skin and coverings of all of T-Rex look like? But almost certainly T-Rex had some level of feathering also. All coelurosaurs have evidence of feathers. Tyrannosauroids have evidence of feathers. T-Rex is a tyrannosauroid and a coelurosaur. It almost certainly had some degree of feather cover. Okay, so that's coelurosaurs, the compsognathids and T-Rex. Then we get to a group, and we see this group is evolving over time, right? We're talking about tens of millions of years of evolution here, nearly 100 million years that we've covered here. Semilunate carpal, and I should need to emphasize, I'm just showing a few things. Everywhere here And there's lots more that I could fill in. There are dozens of characters. I'm just showing the ones that you might have some appreciation for, maybe. Semilunate carpal, right? In this group called Maniraptors. The name refers to this semilunate carpal. Maniraptor, hand snatcher.
Yeah.
These things had very flexible wrist joints. For different reasons, we have very flexible wrist joints too.
They could rotate the wing, you know?
They could rotate, well, before wings, right? So this is before wings. They could rotate their hands, right? Because they had 3-digit hands. And they start to use, remember, they have these bigger muscle areas here. They start to be able to rotate their 3-digit hands. They're now using their hands a lot, we think. Maniraptors, hand snatchers, right? That hand rotation would become critical in flight. When a bird flies, it's not just doing this. It's
No. It has to turn the feathers, yeah.
It's moving its wrists a lot when it flies to prevent drag on the upstroke, right? Oh, bottle nut. All right, that shouldn't be there. Let's zoom into Maniraptors. One last zoom in here. Semilunate carpal, bottle nut. Maniraptors. Let's zoom in to see some Maniraptors real quick. This is a group called Oviraptors. Who has heard of Oviraptors?
Oh, yeah.
Anyone know what the name Oviraptor means?
It's an egg snatcher.
Egg snatcher, right? Given a wrong name, I'll go back. Given the wrong name because they were always found in relation to some eggs, and so people thought they ate eggs, but it turned out they were actually carrying mothers. But that name does not change because we found out something different about that. If that were the case, every time we found out different about something, every name would always change, right? So they're still Oviraptors. They had not only these simple feathers, look, they've got these more complex feathers on the arms and the legs. What for? We'll get back to that. And then Maniraptors have those feathers, but then we see even more complex feathers as the evolution continues to occur. Asymmetric complex feathers.
Yeah.
Feathers with these little barbs so that they kind of stick together. If you've ever played with a feather, it's kind of like Velcro.
They have little zippers.
Little zippers like Velcro,
Yeah.
right? That's what we mean by more complex, and that's central rachis as well. And then asymmetric,
That
right?
means it's the flight like an airfoil.
Airfoil, exactly. It's an aerodynamic function. You've got the rachis. These barbs are shorter on one side than the other.
Like an airfoil.
Very similar to a plane wing, what the shape it takes. We think this had an aerodynamic function,
Yeah.
right? Notice we haven't talked about Velociraptor yet, right?
No.
That's what we get to here. Velociraptor and its relatives, the raptors, the real names Dromaeosaurids. There's ample evidence of these types of feathers in this group, right? There is one of my favorite fossils, Microraptor, right? Had these complex asymmetric feathers on arms and legs, right? And these long tails with feathers at the end of them as well. Beautiful, but based on several things, we don't think this thing was flying. We think it was gliding. We don't think it was flapping its wings to fly. Gliding.
Something like a flying squirrel.
Like a flying squirrel, right? We don't consider a flying squirrel to be a powered flight like a bat,
No,
right?
it's a glider.
But it's an intermediate step,
Yeah.
right? Several others, Chainuraptor, Cynomythosaurus, right? Just to show some others. These are all from Liaoning, right? Dakotaraptor and Velociraptor, this is from Mongolia, this is from the United States, right? They don't preserve in these places exquisite details of feathers, but they do have evidence of where feathers attach to the arms. So even Velociraptor and its close relatives, like Zenulong, this one from Liaoning, which is very much like a Velociraptor, not a flyer or glider at all, like not a glider, too big to be a glider, right? This thing was still covered in those feathers, especially on its on its arms. Right? That's within the raptors. And there's this group called Troodontids that I'll just say also very diverse, had a bunch of feathers, right? Complex asymmetric feathers, but Troodontids, we have some cool evidence of other stuff too. We have some that slept in the formation of a bird, died probably by carbon monoxide poisoning, the volcanic eruption, and buried by ash, right? They have these hyperinflated brains that are kind of transitional towards the hyperinflated brains of birds. These were the smartest of those Mesozoic dinosaurs, and you can see that kind of through the evolution of this group, right? So let's do like a quick review, and I know I'm going over. I knew I was. I should have warned you. But I will again just quickly try to move through some of this, and and feel free to leave if you need to. So we've talked about dinosaurs about 230 million years old, right? Then infused clavicles and theropods, then three-digit hands, then a bowel, and then simple feathers, then semilunar then complex asymmetric feathers. Then we eventually get the first birds about 150 million years ago. We haven't talked about birds yet, right? We've talked about velociraptors is the last thing we talked about, more or less. No one thinks that's a bird. Everyone knows that's a dinosaur, but it's got all these bird-like characteristics, including complex asymmetric feathers. Right? And all of that transition is through here. Liaoning is this stretch, so a bunch of those things are still around, right? And when you think, like, is this the kind of thing that you think of when you think of dinosaur times?
Well, you think that, it reminds me of those little dragons you see on the little teacups in China.
Absolutely. The word for fossil still in Chinese is dragon.
Yeah, because
Right. Long.
It looks an awful lot like this. You go down to the Chinese restaurant, I get all fascinated with the little dinosaur diagrams, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. Almost certainly the myth of dragons comes from many, many fossils that have been discovered in this exquisite place for fossils.
Yeah.
This and a bunch of other places in China. This is dinosaur times. Deep in dinosaur times. Right? So change your idea of what you think dinosaur times look like. There were tons of feathered dinosaurs. Some of them were just like covered in feathers like hair. Some of them had these feathers on their arms and tails. Some of them, by the time we get to birds, had maybe started to flap their wings to fly. Some were gliders, right? An incredible diversity. And I've showed you a few things. We're talking about hundreds of specimens, hundreds upon hundreds of dozens of different species, hundreds to thousands of specimens. Let's talk about feathers real quick, right?
How does this change like our idea of like dinosaur extinction in 65 million years ago?
We'll end there. Dinosaur extinction. So feathers, a closer look, right? I kind of said Coelurosaurs had simple feathers. By the time we get to troodontids and raptors, and then birds, which are in there too, right? They have these complex asymmetric feathers. But then this is always a simplification, right? It's more complex than that, right? It's not just like, oh, simple down-like feathers, then these evolve, right? Because really, we see all sorts of different, gradually evolving, more and more complex feather patterns throughout the evolution of those groups. And here, there's a bunch of huge groups that I'm not even including just to move along. Right? So it's a much more complex story, right? And when you think of that, something really fascinating out of the story, one of my favorite things about evolution, which is that, okay, feathers, I've told you about this link between feathers and reptilian scales. They have the similar protein structure, that beta-keratin, right? That similar genes control the development of scales and feathers, right? And they have similar developmental patterns. If you look at how a bird, from embryo to adulthood, how does it grow its feathers? Those feathers start off as little, what we call papillae or placodes, same thing that would eventually solidify into a scale, continues to grow into a tube. And in that tube, that long little tube, becomes split into these little downy things, right? And then those downy things continue to grow. A central rachis forms, right? That central quill forms. And then those barbules form, those little hooklets, to make it like that Velcro. And then, if that bird evolves flight and those feathers are going to become flight feathers, eventually asymmetry forms. That's how a feather develops in the lifetime of a bird. That's also how, more or less, feathers evolved in the history of dinosaur evolution. They started off as little hollow tubes. Then those tubes became, split, right? And then the central rachis forms throughout the evolution of this group. And then they become barbuled, and then they become more asymmetric, right? The same way that happens in the single lifetime of a single bird, embryologically to adulthood. Right? This is one of the most fascinating things in all of evolution to me. You can sum it up as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Heard that again and again.
Ontogeny, what does ontogeny mean? Development, meaning you from zygote, right, to adulthood. That's your ontogeny, your development. Your development recaps, replays aspects of your evolutionary history, the tree of life, right? You have gills as an embryo. You have a tail as an embryo, right? Because you evolved from things that have gills and tails. You live in an amniotic sac, right? in water until you're born, right? Until that water breaks. Vertebrates evolved in water, right? When you're born, you'll first crawl around for a bit before you can walk, right? It takes a year or so before walking on two legs is something that you are capable of. Our ancestors were on all fours for millions of years before they evolved bipedalism, right? Same with birds. Think of it. Early Coelurosaurs were covered in simple feathers, but they could not fly. A baby bird is covered in simple feathers before it is able to fly. And this is something that we see time and time again in fascinating ways throughout evolution. So feathers evolved well before flight. Why?
Well, feathers are good insulation.
Great insulation is one clear, obvious answer. They're still the best, lightest insulation we can basically buy or manufacture.
And you
Right?
see those little ducklings, if they get in the water, they can stay dry.
They can still stay dry because of the oils that you mentioned, right? So they're moisture wicking, they're lightweight, they're super good at keeping things warm. We still see this used in birds today, right? And the earliest dinosaurs were really small. Things that are small lose heat a lot more easily, right? And so the earliest things that had feathers were small dinosaurs that needed to retain heat in relatively cold climates, like China was at that time, right? Then we see evidence that those feathers probably used a lot more for display. Remember that oviraptor I showed you with its tail feathers and its arm feathers? Literally evidence that on there's strong muscle attachments to the bone. Muscle attachments leave scars on bones. At the end of the bones where the tail is attached to, there are large muscle attachments.
And its tail.
Literally evidence that it was shaking its tail feathers, right? For display. Birds, not all birds fly. All birds use feathers for display, right? This is a major reason of what makes a bird, right? And then eventually, we see evidence that maybe they were used for running, jumping, balance, we think, right? A little lift as you're trying to get on top of your prey, right? Running uphill, turning. Ostriches don't fly, they use their feathers to turn, right? Things along those lines. Maybe camouflage, defense, water capture, prey capture. This is a common creationist argument you hear. What's the use of half a wing, right? There's lots of uses, actually, of half a wing, right? Lots of uses of half a wing. And lots of reasons these things would become slowly and slowly larger, more complex over time. Right? I'll skip what I was going to say there. All right, wrapping it up. We'll move quick through this. This I'm just going to skip, actually. Let's get to the first thing that we can maybe properly consider a bird. And even though it's a little bit debatable, the thing that might make this group what they are is that they have this bird-like characteristic of powered flight. Being able to flap wings to fly. Not very well at first, to be sure, right? But to some extent, right? And we usually look at that depending on how big the feathers are, how big the wings are, compared to body size, compared to what we project the weight as. When could that actually look like it would work, right? And the first thing that we think could do that, right, was Archaeopteryx. Remember Archaeopteryx? This is the iconic transitional fossil. When you come look at Archaeopteryx here, right, look at its dinosaur characteristics. Very specific technurian characteristics, right? 3-digit hands with claws. This is a flying dinosaur, very clearly, or at least winged with at least some ability to fly. Here we're looking at sizes here. Huge, long arms, huge feathers on those arms. Right? So this could maybe flap away a little bit to generate a little lift, but then mostly glide. Right? It also had teeth.
Yep.
It also had a long bony tail, very characteristic of a specific structures within dinosaur tails as well that I didn't get into. But unlike other dinosaurs, this is the first thing that may have been able to flap to some extent, to fly. Yes?
So that's an Archaeopteryx, right?
Archaeopteryx.
Okay.
Archaeopteryx, replica.
But right there, it looks like there's little strokes of feathers.
Yep, feathers.
Why?
These are feathers.
Oh. Yeah, never mind.
Okay, yeah, so remember, even before this group, feathers with aerodynamic functions, probably for gliding, had already evolved. But now we think maybe for powered flight.
Well, here's a question, but ever heard the term rare as hen's teeth? Do hens, that when they develop, have little teeth in them?
That's a great question. There are, no, they don't have teeth when they develop. That's just been lost.
Recapitulation thing.
Right, so,
Back in time.
great, it's a great question. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny does not mean that everything that existed in your past will exist at some point. It's just we see it mirrored a lot. So we don't see teeth in birds when they're developing, for example.
They wanted us to come up, you know.
Yeah, but it's a really good question. Okay, so we got powered flight. We've got that iconic Archaeopteryx, which we've already talked about. Then here, there's so much stuff. I just want you to give, I've been doing this kind of throughout. I want to give you a sense for how little I'm actually showing you, even going as far over as I am here, right? So these are between Archaeopteryx and then the ancestor of all living birds. Because Archaeopteryx is not like any bird today, right? It had a long bony tail, it had teeth, it had 3 fingers, it had a bunch of other dinosaur characteristics that we don't see in birds today. So clearly birds continue to evolve in significant ways. Now, by about 70 million years ago is when we have more or less a modern sort of bird characteristics that are all present, and all living birds can descend from that point, right? So by definition, these things are all extinct. They did not leave any. This is not a bird. This is not a modern bird. This is not a modern bird. This is not a modern bird. All modern birds evolved from within this, which is why they have more characteristics. And this would take another 80 million years or so, right, of continued evolution of these early flyers. And I'm showing you 6 things here, right? There's 80 different species within that part of the transitional fossil record. 80 different species, not fossils, thousands of fossils, 80 different species. Each species showing us how some little change, each branching point, there's changes occurring, changes occurring, changes occurring. I'm going to highlight 3 of those changes. Right? One is a pygostyle. Let's look at Confuciusornis. Confuciusornis here, beautiful fossil there, has a pygostyle. Right? A pygostyle is the loss of that long bony tail. That long bony tail is a heavy thing to carry around if you're trying to fly. Right? The pygostyle fuses the last vertebrae, shortens the tail, and allows feathers to be attached to it.
And then there's these bird of paradise, looks like that.
Yeah, birds of paradise have these long tail feathers attached to their pygostyles too.
Yeah.
You can see here's a pygostyle. See, still has 3 claws, right? But now it's got a pygostyle. It's a little bit more bird-like, right? This is a modern, I think this is a pigeon here, showing its pygostyle. Right? Carpometacarpus, right? Remember that early birds had these 3 fingers with claws?
Yeah.
Carpometacarpus, those 3 fingers become fused together. The carpus, right, is the wrist bones, carpal tunnel, right? Carpus. Metacarpus are your palm bones. Those become fused together into a structure that birds have. And we see that as a next step, right? And we think that this helps provide strength. As birds stroke and move like this, they don't want all this sort of loose bone structure in here. That all becomes fused together potentially for a stronger stroke. Right? So fused carpometacarpus. We start to see that. This is from also Liang Ning. You can see the fused hand bones start to fuse here, but this thing still had teeth. Right?
Why birds are more efficient flyers than like bats?
Well, efficient in different ways. They're more powerful flyers. Bats are much more efficient maneuverably, right, than a bird is. A bird needs to just keep lift maintained, and while a bat, except for hummingbirds, right, which evolved after a long more time and continue to evolve flight. But bats, probably in total metabolic efficiency, birds are more efficient because they're always getting oxygen and the nature of how they fly. But a bat is much more efficient in terms of maneuverability. So, yeah. And we start to see this carpometacarpus, but it still doesn't have a keeled sternum. I'm going to show you a keeled sternum next, because then keeled sternum, as we'll see in Ichthyornis, is when we start to see that breastbone, right? All this meat that attaches there. Why do birds have so much meat there? Because those are flight muscles, right? Those are flight muscles. And they attach to this huge bone here called the keeled sternum, right? The breastbone. And so here you can see Ichthyornis, but this thing has a carpometacarpus, it has a pygostyle, it has a keeled sternum, but it still has teeth, right?
Yeah, so it's rather intense.
So birds, We start calling them birds once they could fly, but they continue to change, and this is just 3 out of 100 changes that happened over 80 million years. Pygostyle style, carpometacarpus, lose the tail, fuse the wrist bones, gain the keeled sternum for more powerful flight muscles, and then of course, the ancestor of all living birds. No living birds have teeth, so then the ancestor of all living birds, that's one of the last things to happen in the ancestor of all living dinosaurs. So about 70 million years ago, we now start to get groups that are still around, right? These are all extinct. A lot of stuff within here has gone extinct, right? But these groups are still around, paleognats and neognats. Paleognats include the ostrich. Anyone know what this is?
Turkey.
Cassowary.
Cassowary. Super cool bird. Look it up if you don't know already. Tinamu, echidna. Oh, not echidna. Kiwi. Emu.
Yeah.
Those are the paleognats. Some of them are still alive. Neognats are every other bird that you can think of. Right?
Wow.
So, just to sum, right? We see those earliest manoraptors, those things that already had all these bird-like characteristics, just not able to fly yet. We see those earliest manoraptors in the Jurassic. By the end of the Jurassic, we start seeing birds that are somewhat capable to flap their wings a little bit, right? But by the end of the Cretaceous, those things are well-adapted flyers, right? 80 million years of innovation to become much better flyers. But then something happens, right? What happens here 65 million years ago?
Well, the TK boundary.
Now we call it the KPG
Yeah.
instead of the KT.
Yeah.
But it's the KPG mass extinction,
Right.
one of the largest extinctions in Earth's history, right? That wipes out a bunch of stuff. But one of the groups that survived, right? Even, remember, there were all these different bird groups. I should, just go back here and say, like even this group, this is the enantiomorphiers. There were 20 species within this group, right? They were a successful group of early birds, right? Even that group,
It perished.
that group all goes extinct,
Yeah.
right? Other avialans all go extinct. One group, the ones that had a beak, the ones that had the carpometacarpus and all those things that we just talked about, and the lost their teeth, only one group of dinosaurs survived the mass extinction. All the longnecks go extinct. All the other theropods go extinct. All the other herbivores go extinct. Only one group, the group of dinosaurs that lost their teeth and were well-adapted flyers, survived this. And there's a lot of good reasons we think that might be the case. I'll leave it at there for now. Maybe leave time for questions. And not only, they were a subset. They weren't like the dominant birds. They were one subset of birds. The enantiomorphiers were much more dominant.
Yeah, that's
Right? They were a tiny thing. But then after everything else was extinct, they explode in diversity. Right? Which is a similar story to, let's talk about the Mesozoic again. We've got the first dinosaurs in the Triassic. A lot of people don't know, mammals evolved like almost immediately after dinosaurs, right? Almost immediately in geological terms, meaning within 20 million years, right? Almost immediately after, we see mammals and pterosaurs evolve, right? Not closely related, but from different groups, right? So mammals are around this whole time, right? It's the age of dinosaurs, but mammals are around and evolving. They would eventually evolve into placental mammals even, right? Then we get the first birds in the Jurassic. Then we get this mass extinction. It wipes out all the land-living dinosaurs except one group. It wipes out a bunch of mammal groups as well, except one group in effect, right? And then after so many things go extinct, these two things diversify spectacularly. One remaining group of dinosaurs, what we call today the birds, right, and mammals, and they would go on to dominate in the Cenozoic. Right? And then, of course, actually a little plug here. So, like, I've had maybe no one in here. I have people audit my class. This is, I've just combined 3 lectures from one class. Right? This is what I teach on the history of life and evolution. That class meets Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3. It is a lot of fun, I think. And I have people audited all the time. So Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 to 4:15, if anyone wants to audit this class. There's the oldest evidence of life goes back 3.5 billion years, right? We talked about dinosaurs today. Like, we think of dinosaurs as like ancient life. Dinosaurs is recent life, right? There's so much important and fascinating stuff I didn't even mention. Right? Learn more about it. It's how we got here. It's why we're here. So I'd recommend checking that out. And thanks for listening. Sorry for going over.
To get the DNA to how they've been able to.
So a good question about dinosaur DNA. Have we been able to get DNA from feathers? The oldest DNA that we've ever found in the fossil record is under 1 million years old.
Okay,
Right?
so I was wondering how much that would still be viable.
It degrades too quickly. It degrades too quickly to go back that far.
Yeah.
So no dino DNA
Rats.
from the Mesozoic.
They could probably find out where the hens keep them.
Any other questions?
What's a different perspective on the birds of paradise, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But to put it, you can see it, look at the dragons on the little foxes that are in the back.
Definitely.
You can see the little foxes. And so it's looking at the dinosaurs, that bird, you heard of dinosaurs.
Oh, please, before you leave, come look at some of these. We got some real fossils up here. Some of them are pretty exquisite. I'd recommend checking them out.